Now, Sweden and Slovenia have adopted harsher border control measures to stem the refugee influx onto their soils. Sweden has decided to reinstate border controls for 10 days from Thursday, while Slovenia has begun erecting new fences along its borders. Slovenia's construction of a new razor-wire fence sparked criticism from neighboring Croatia and Italy. The Croatian Interior Minister slammed the move as a misuse of resources, while an Italian lawmaker decried it as cynical and inhumane. Meanwhile, the African Union chief took a swipe at European Union leaders for taking what she called a fortress approach towards asylum seekers.
The problem that we are facing today is in part because some countries in Europe have taken a fortress approach. There is no part of the world that can be a fortress.
Zuma made those remarks in a summit of EU and African leaders on the refugee crisis. She also urged African leaders to industrialize and modernize the continent to encourage young people not to leave their homelands. The European Council President Donald Tusk called for a joint approach and concrete steps to cope with the crisis. This as EU members remain divided on how to tackle the crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly fleeing wars in the Middle East and North Africa, have crossed the Mediterranean to reach Europe. Well, to discuss that further, I'm now joined by Mr. Wahid Azal, who is an independent scholar and political commentator, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Berlin. Thanks very much for joining us here on Press TV. The fortress approach, how do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, it is hypocritical, considering that this problem was created, this refugee problem was created by EU as a co-participant of imperial policy. It is quite hypocritical for them to be putting borders up now. But let us not forget that this effectively signals the death of the Schengen in Europe, and that is a real tragedy.
And, you know, obviously, Mr. Azal, at this point, we're also getting news that Africa is being pressured to take back some refugees. How and why do you think Europe is doing that?
Well, because this crisis it is a crisis. I mean, they're offering the Africans, I've read somewhere around the ballpark of over €1 billion, basically bribing these African nations to take back the refugees. But the question remains that the same set of problems that exist in Europe are now going to exist in Africa on a bigger scale, if that is going to be implemented that way.
So where does this leave European values such as humanity, freedom, etc.?
In tatters, in complete tatters.
And do you think that that will change going forward, or are we seeing a more extremist Europe, if I may use that term, coming forward?
Well, we are witnessing the birth of a more extremist Europe, but as I've said in the past, a lot of the extremism is actually being fueled from outside of Europe. There are interests, especially in North America, that are determined to cultivate fascism on this continent. I mean, the same sort of fascism that was on the continent in the 1930s. So this is a deliberate policy, and it becomes even more obvious the more countries such as Germany are trying to pry themselves away from imperial policy making. You know, as Germany, for example, begins to move away from the United States, you know, you have a cropping of extremist Nazi groups all over Germany.
All right, we'll leave it there at that point. But of course, we do appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us today. That was Mr. Wahid Azal, who'd been speaking to us live from Berlin.